And talking about the data, what is the relationship like between the police and the prosecution? I only ask that
Yeah.
because surely when you are investigating an allegation, you're going to want to charge someone there's enough evidence to charge them, whereas the prosecution have the charging point is where there's a realistic prospect of conviction. So surely there's some cases in the middle there where you, as a police force, think there's enough evidence, but the prosecution is saying no, you can't charge.
Well, of course, there's some offences that the police don't need the CPS to authorise prosecutions. We can authorise those ourselves, which is generally the much lower level cases, or cases that could be heard at magistrates or the Crown Court where the suspect might have admitted them. But I think that it varies. It can be fraught. Everyone has their own role within the criminal justice system, whether it's the police, the prosecution, the defence. Everyone has their own role. They've got a goal and an aim. And every police officer, if they're dealing with an offence, they should be looking at actually gathering the evidence and being this neutral investigator to identify, is there enough evidence to justify a charge, or even consider an out-of-court disposal, or have we even got the right person? And this should be that in the course of the investigation, by doing that, by doing this open-ended investigation and transparent investigation, you'll identify easily, have you got enough evidence? If you haven't got enough evidence, then that's the end of the case. And alternatively, if you haven't got enough evidence, is that because maybe this isn't the right person? And so it can be a bit of a battle, but this is where experience comes through, experience of individual officers seeking experience from other people to try and get a better understanding. And once people get that better understanding and knowing that everyone has their own roles, that it becomes easier to investigate then.
I suppose we as a criminal team have seen, I think I'm right in saying this, a number of fraud matters come in that the police, it is remarkable, I think, the number of instances where we've had people that consider themselves to be victims of fraud, where the police have taken no further action. And I just wondered if in that particular area of offence, whether that's something that you have noticed or whether it's not an area that you've come across or seen any difference recently.
I haven't got masses of experience. Frauds are becoming more and more common, probably with the advances of technology. A lot of these do come from abroad. Some frauds as well, where people will, on rare occasions, try and use the police to conduct a criminal investigation, whereas a civil investigation is more appropriate, because you've got the different evidence thresholds, if you like. The police need to make sure that there's enough evidence to provide a realistic prospect of conviction for a criminal trial, whereas if it's dealt with civilly, it's on the balance of probabilities. So is it more likely than not that that person was responsible for it? So it's a much lower threshold if things are dealt with civilly. The thing with civil cases, of course, it costs money, and no one wants to pay money, especially if the police will investigate for free.
Yeah. Thank you.
If I can talk to you about intelligence, not intelligence of police officers, but intelligence that you receive for drugs. So if you were told that there's drug dealing happening at a house, what are the steps to obtain a warrant to actually enter the property?
So depending on where the intelligence has come from, sometimes people will speak directly to police officers, and those police officers will know who they're speaking to. Other times it might come through the likes of Crime Stoppers, anonymous intelligence. One of the things that we would factor in is that if someone has told me, for example, that there is drug dealing going on at this house and there are drugs stored at that house, I've got various options. One, I could just, on the basis of that, I could go straight in and make an arrest. I could try and look for, get a warrant, or I could look to do something more covert. And there's no secret, everyone knows what covert policing is, whether we're using it as surveillance, that sort of thing. However, one thing that we'll always consider is about the risk to the person who's provided that information. So if that person who's provided me that information about the drugs is the only person who knows that, and I go in there with a drugs warrant, that person who is dealing with the drugs outside the house will know where that information has come from. And our overriding priority is to make sure that any person who provides information to us is protected. And if it is just a case of one person has provided that with no other information, we wouldn't do anything about it, because we're weighing up, you're weighing up the sort of balance and the priorities there. But if you have, let's say, multiple lots of information from numerous different sources saying that there's evidence, so we can then look to get a warrant, in which case it would be applying to a magistrate, presenting the information, the intelligence that we have to the magistrate, and if the magistrate is satisfied that there is good grounds to believe that a warrant is warranted, that they will provide that, and then we then can go and execute.
And that application is made behind closed doors with the magistrates outside of the courtroom.
Yes, it is.
For obvious reasons.
So it's not a public hearing, so no one other than the police officer who's making that representation and the magistrate, no one else will know about it.
And are the police starting to use drones for surveillance?
Drones are becoming more and more popular. As much as anything, they're a hell of a lot cheaper. I'm not sure the exact figures for police helicopters. I'm sure I heard a figure of it's like £1,000 an hour for a police helicopter to be in the air. It's probably more than that now. Whereas drones are becoming much easier. They are held in some police cars, so they can just put them up, and they're incredibly easy and easy way to gather not just surveillance, but also evidence. One of the main things I think we probably use them for is a lot for dealing with missing people as well, to cover a better ground.
Now, during this podcast series, we're taking a fictional scenario from the start to the finish of the legal journey. And this being the first episode, it's about a woman named Kelly, who's in her 20s, works in the city, started taking drugs and became addicted to Class A drugs. And one Friday, she decides to drive to a friend's house for a party that weekend, having used drugs, so under the influence of drugs, and has a large amount of drugs in her car for personal use. And she is pulled over by police officers whilst driving. What are you looking for when out on the road for vehicles that potentially are being driven by drivers under the influence of something?
So when we're stopping police vehicles, a lot of people sort of don't necessarily realise that we don't really have to have specific grounds to stop a vehicle in the first place. Under the Road Traffic Act, we can stop a vehicle to check that someone is simply allowed to be driving a vehicle, has a licence, has insurance. Following that, if we subsequently had grounds to search a vehicle, let's say we could smell drugs, we could see packaging in the car that looked like it contained drugs. We can either then conduct a search, a stop and search, as people will know it, under the Misuse of Drugs Act, or we could simply arrest that person on suspicion of possession of a controlled drug, and then we've got the power to search that car and that person anyway. When it comes to stopping cars, criminals use cars. There's maybe in inner city areas they might use more public transport, but everyone uses a car. There's very few people these days who don't use cars. From a police perspective, you can crack down on the use of criminals using the road network, then that's a good way to prevent crime.
And if someone is under the influence, or you suspect someone is under the influence of something, you can conduct a field impairment test for drugs.
Yes.
Can you explain what that is?
Certainly in my force, it tends to only be road traffic officers who can do that. And effectively, it's a drugs wipe, where it's something that gets wiped on the inside of the mouth. You wait a couple of minutes, and then it will tell you whether you appear to be over the limit of a controlled drug. And if you are, you then get arrested on suspicion of driving whilst over the limit of with controlled drugs in your system. And then you can come into custody, and you can be subject to a blood sample where you can specifically examine how much of a certain drug is in your body.
Mm-hmm. And if you take a step back slightly, so when you take someone to custody, what happens as soon as they enter custody? So talking to the custody sergeant and being booked in.
Well, even before that, you're saying about arrested, especially for someone who has never been arrested before, they're going to be put in handcuffs. That is pretty much going to be a certainty for anyone who's arrested. Handcuffs are not comfortable. They're not designed to be comfortable. They're not your pink fluffy ones. They are steel, they are metal, and if you move around too much, they will hurt even more. So the best thing you can do is keep still. Once you take into custody, the handcuffs will be taken off, and you will meet the suspect will meet the custody sergeant, and the person who's arrested or is with that suspect will have to explain to the custody sergeant why this person has been arrested, what they've been arrested for. And as long as the custody sergeant's happy, they will authorise their detention, which means that they will say this suspect who's been arrested can stay at the police station. Following that, you will be searched. Now, in this example, if someone's been arrested for possession of drugs, even potentially possession with intent to supply controlled drugs, then there will be a very detailed search, and there could be an even more detailed search of an intimate or strip search. As well, which is never going to be pleasant for anyone, and trust me, police officers don't enjoy it either. But that will always be done by a member of the same sex, and worst case scenario, it can involve you taking all your clothes off and making sure that you haven't got anything secreted or hidden anywhere, and it would be done professionally, it would be done appropriately, but it's not pleasant for anyone.
Have you ever had to do that?
Yeah. It's not nice.
With handcuffs, does each police officer have a set key for their handcuffs, or is it a universal key?
It's a universal key, but every police officer will have their own allocated handcuffs as well. But yeah, and they're all double locked. So once someone's put in handcuffs, they'll be double locked, which basically means they can't get any tighter. So sometimes people will say, "No, they're getting tighter. They hurt too much." Well, generally because they're moving around, and that's causing it to the handcuffs were locked and they physically can't get any tighter then. So yeah.
And when, say you conducted this search and say you did find drugs on the suspect or defendant, what happens to them?
So the drugs would be seized as evidence. They would be put in a tamper-proof evidence bag. Depending on what the suspect has already been arrested on suspicion of, they would be probably further arrested for possessing that specific item. Because it's not just drugs, sometimes it can be weapons, that sort of thing, or other evidence linked to, mobile phones these days as well, that can be linked to drug dealing. And then that will be subject to forensic testing, which, depending on the circumstances, we can do, the police, certain people within the police can do sort of, I can never remember what they're called, but tests in-house, which can be done immediately, but generally what's happened is they're sent off to a forensic lab and they're more formally tested to say how much of a certain substance there is and what that substance is.
What do you do if you suspect someone swallowed drugs?
That would be treated as a medical emergency, so they'd be taken to hospital, by police escort. It's one of these things that if you were at the roadside, we wouldn't take them to custody first. We'd be taking them straight to hospital, or be looking for an ambulance to come. Police officers are not trained paramedics. That would be treated as a medical emergency. It would then be sort of a judgment call as to, do you stay with the suspect where you are and call an ambulance to come to you, or is it more serious than that, or are you close enough to the hospital to suggest that you should maybe take that person there? At the end of the day, anyone who's in our custody and control, we've got a duty of care towards them, and they become our responsibility. So if someone's swallowed controlled drugs, then they need to be treated for that.
And do you have to wait in A&E, or do you go straight through?
Well, we'd go to A&E. There would be a process. Ultimately, that would be down to the hospital to decide. We'd simply turn up. We wouldn't automatically get priority just because we're the police. However, if we were to simply say that, this person is taking controlled drugs, well, then it becomes a medical issue. Of course, that suspect might deny that they had, and then you've got, well, okay, what do we do now? And that would be down to the medical staff to sort of do what they felt right. Things such as x-rays might be an example, but actually if a suspect is saying, no, I didn't swallow anything, well, from a doctor's point of view, why would they then want to do an x-ray, especially if the suspect is not consenting to that as well?
And do you, as a police officer, feel safe sitting in an A&E type environment, potentially on a Friday night, Saturday night, people intoxicated, potentially shouting abuse at you?
I think a lot of as a police officer, you've got to be confident in your own skills and abilities. We carry a lot of equipment, handcuffs, incapacitant spray, baton, sometimes taser, radio to call for assistance if need be, body cameras to capture evidence. But if someone's in a hospital, generally they're probably not going to be in handcuffs. Again, it's on a case-by-case basis because they'll be being treated medically. And I think you just got to be confident. If that person is such a risk or such a violent person, then you're probably going to have more people with you, whether it's 3 or 4 officers. And again, this is something that the public can often be concerned about when they see lots of police officers dealing with one individual. However, the idea is that it's a safer way, and very few people realise that. If someone wants to fight a police officer or police officers, they're going to be swinging, kicking, punching, spitting, biting, the works. And if you can have maybe 5 police officers dealing with one person, it's going to be a much safer resolution for that person. Because if it's one-on-one, it's just going to be fists, it's going to be a baton, it's not going to end nicely for anyone. Whereas if you've got other police officers, you can have one person on a leg and an arm and a head. Well, straight away, 2 arms, 2 legs and a head, that's 5 police officers to control and look after that person. It might look like overkill, but actually it's the best thing for that person.